heartbreaking for someone who cares about an institution to see it degenerate in that way. But the book isn't merely about Northwestern, because what's happening at Northwestern is happening on so many campuses. And those of you who are arriving at this webinar are probably familiar with the campus scene, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So in talking about Northwestern, he's really talking about a burning situation, a situation of really extreme importance for Jews and anybody who cares about the academy and education and really the future of this country, I would argue. So I'm honored that I'll have a chance to take you folks through the book over the next few weeks. I will insert my own thoughts along the way sometimes, so please don't assume that everything I say is Scott's opinion. And the plan will be to talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A or discussion at the end of that. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Let me introduce myself a little bit more thoroughly. So that's me. I am a professor of philosophy at Connecticut College and also of Jewish studies. If my website is here to find more information about me. I also am the campus bureau editor for the Allgemeiner, which is a wonderful news outlet that focuses on issues of concern about Israel and about Jews, and I recommend everybody check that out. You can sign up for the daily newsletter so you can stay on top of what's going on those matters, on those subjects, and in particular on the campus, because I am campus bureau editor there. So we have a regular supply of campus stories. Also on Facebook, I do run a group called Anti-Zionism on Campus to keep our eye on what's going on campus. Please, if you're on Facebook, come and join that group, and do feel free to follow me on Twitter. On the right, these are just some of my books. In recent years, I've been really focusing on Jewishness and Israel-related matters. I've got this book, Anti-Zionism on Campus. It's one of my favorite topics, unfortunately, documenting what's going on the campus scene. This past year, I published with my colleague Corinne Blackmer, Poisoning the Wells, which is documenting anti-Semitism in the United States, which of course is beginning to burn out of control for anyone who's reading the news. And most recently, I published this book, Nevergreen, which is a novel which might be of interest to folks on this webinar. It's a satirical account of campus cancel culture, its ideological excesses, and of course, the impact on the Jews. It's getting a lot of good reviews, so I do hope you'll have a look at that. It's also entertaining, if I do say so myself. So that's me, and my interest in matters Jewish and matters Israel, advocating for Israel, especially on campus, is what brings me to this webinar and what's brought me, of course, to Scott's book. So what is the situation we're dealing with? The surge in anti-Semitism, not just across the United States, it's North America, it's certainly going on in Canada, it's certainly going on in Europe. Just today, the Allgemeiner had a story that in Germany, they're averaging 5 anti-Semitic incidents a day, and another story about how France is ground zero. Apparently, Deborah Lipstadt, the U.S. envoy on anti-Semitism, just remarked that France is ground zero for anti-Semitism in Europe. And so Europe is burning, the United States is burning, Canada is burning. We have a very serious situation on our hands. And our focus, of course, is going to be primarily on the campus, but it's part of this broader context. On campus, anti-Zionism is everywhere. It is raging. And of course, so is anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism of the classical form from the right, and anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism, primarily on the left. And that will be some of our big themes tonight. So we'll be taking a look at those things. Let me start off with a couple of examples of recent cases. My job for the Allgemeiner, I spend a lot of time sort of scouring the news to keep track of what's going on campuses. And all of these episodes are just in recent weeks. The Harvard Crimson episode is just from the spring, from May or so. But literally every week crossing my desk are stories like some of the ones I'm about to summarize for you very briefly. So at the end of the school year, I think it was last May, the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper at Harvard, put out an editorial. The editorial staff had decided that they now advocated for the liberation of Palestine, that they endorsed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement against Israel, whose goal is, of course, to ultimately destroy the lone Jewish state in the world, and accused Israel of all sorts of horrible things. This Not only is this a preeminent student newspaper, preeminent college, obviously, but it reflects a very serious trend of student college newspapers jumping on this bandwagon. You have McGill University a couple of years ago, for example, their editorial board announced it was official editorial policy that they would no longer publish anything supportive of Zionism. So Zionists are silenced at McGill University. Wellesley College, their newspaper, just a couple of weeks ago, did something similar. The editorial board, I believe it was unanimously endorsed the liberation of Palestine, the BDS movement, and in particular, they endorsed this vile thing that was called the Mapping Project, which was published in the spring. This was, the Mapping Project was trying to expose basically the Zionist network in the Boston, Massachusetts area. And the way to confront Zionism was to dismantle the Zionist network in America. And they were beginning with Boston. And of course, what did they mean by that? What they listed on this project was basically names and addresses of every Jewish institution in the Boston area, including synagogues, day schools, obviously yeshivas, JCCs, federations, things like that, including individuals. And again, they publish this information with the goal of dismantling that network, which is nothing if not an invitation or incitement to violence against these institutions. And Wellesley College newspaper endorsed it as providing a, quote, vital service. Just a few weeks ago as well, Berkeley Law School, you might have read about this one. This one got a lot of play, but Berkeley Law School, Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the primary anti-Israel group that has something like 200 chapters on North American campuses at this point. They led the way. They got 8 or 9 other student groups in the law school to endorse a policy of not platforming Zionists. Lest you think that's not a big deal, the other groups that endorsed this policy included the women's students groups and the Black student groups and probably the LGBTQ groups there as well, which, although they may only be 9 or 10 student groups, represent something like 80% of the student body and population. And further, when they say they're not going to platform Zionists, they don't mean something simple like this. Nobody expects Students for Justice in Palestine to bring in a speaker who's going to support Zionism. That no one would expect that of them. What they're demanding of all these other groups, and they're trying to get more groups to sign on to this, is that they shouldn't bring in anybody to speak who, even if it has nothing to do with the topic of their talk, has ever expressed support for Zionism, which, by the way, includes the overwhelming majority of Jews, most of whom are supportive of Zionism in one form or another. And so what that means is the women's group will not platform even some expert on legal issues dealing with women if that person happens to have supported Zionism somewhere else in some form or another. What that effectively means is Jews are not welcome in these clubs. CUNY law faculty, the entire faculty endorsed something similar a little bit before that. And then lastly, the University of Wisconsin, just, I don't know, a week or so ago, their music magazine, student music magazine, put out on social media this little meme referring to last year or so. There was a video that went viral. It was a bunch of Jewish boys wearing their kippot, singing a psalm, and it was very beautiful, and it was very popular. It went around the internet a few times. The Wisconsin Music Magazine forwarded that, but with a heading expressing disdain and disappointment when they realized that they were singing about Israel. Now, I want you to reflect for a moment how offensive that is. These were Jewish boys wearing kippot, singing a psalm from Hebrew scripture dating back 3,000 years, referring to their love of Jerusalem, which has been the Jewish capital for 3,000 years. And that is offensive to the University of Wisconsin Music Magazine. Basically, Jewish people being Jewish is offensive. That's what that one shows. These are just a handful of recent cases, and I'm telling you, every week a bunch of these are crossing my desk, institutions all over North America and Europe as well. And these episodes are just on top of the unbelievable wave of swastika graffiti. Swastikas are appearing all over the place, multiple instances on multiple campuses. Mezuzot are being torn off of doors, and not just the Hillel House door, but individual students' dorm room doors. And I think it was the University of Indiana, mezuzah was torn off a door and set on fire outside the door of a student. That's like a direct threat to the student who lives there.
the amount of vandalism of Hillel houses or Hillel buildings and Chabad houses. USC Hillel House, their front door was, glass door was smashed a number of weeks ago. Several Chabad houses have been hit with arson in the last couple of years. And on top of all of this, the verbal harassment is unbelievable. Just for example, a couple of weeks ago, right, this is all recent stuff, George Washington University, a mob of Israel haters collected outside the Hillel building. So here they are, anti-Zionists, but what are they targeting? The Jewish Center on campus, chanting incredibly horrible things, including, excuse the French, Zionists fuck off and Zionists get the fuck out. Get the fuck out. Right? This is what Jewish students are having screamed at them in the Jewish Center at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. So this is a little taste of what's going on campuses, which raises the question, is it time to get out? This was an article by Lyle Leibovitz 3 years ago. Already he was raising the question about whether Jewish students belong in North American universities anymore, and things have only gotten worse since then. I'm not going to address the question, should we get out of the universities, but clearly we need to be aware of what's going on in these universities, and we need to be thinking about how to respond, how to support our Jewish students, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, how did we get here? How did we get here? America, the golden land, and the university, which in the 1990s, something like 25% of Harvard students were Jewish. Today, that number is down to like 5%, by the way. So there was a period when the university that was a stepping stone for Jewish advancement in America, which welcomed the Jews. But now we see what's going on with anti-Semitism surging across the country and surging on campuses. So how did we get here? Enter Conspiracy U. That's really the question in many ways that Scott is trying to answer in his book. There's a lot of good stuff in the book, a lot of wonderful stuff in the book, but some of the truly major contributions to my eye of the book include these, that he shows so clearly, helps us come see so clearly that both right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Zionism, left-wing people deny they're anti-Semites, right? So they call themselves anti-Zionists. But he helps us see that both right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Zionism are conspiracy theories. And in so seeing, we come to see that they are really two sides of the same coin. There's this idea, I'll show you a couple of slides in just a second, but this idea that the extreme right and the extreme left come together, even though right and left disagree on about everything. As you get to the extreme versions of right and extreme versions of left, they coalesce. And of course, where does extreme right and extreme left come together? They come together in their antagonism toward the Jews. And when we put these side by side, the right-wing anti-Semitism and the left-wing quote unquote anti-Zionism, we see so clearly how they really, in the end, are no different from each other. And yet, while right-wing anti-Semitism is very easy to detect, we all know it when we see it, and it's also not very present on campuses, despite the individual we're about to talk about. There are some exceptions, and actually frequently outside like white supremacist groups come to campuses and litter them with various horrible flyers and things and stickers and things like that. But in terms of the people who are living and working on the campuses, right-wing anti-Semitism is not particularly present there. In contrast, left-wing anti-Zionism is couched as a human rights social justice movement, and its anti-Semitism is much harder to see because it's buried beneath this veneer of human rights and social justice activism. But while it's harder to see, it's far more present on campuses. Today's campuses, or at least the major campuses, are just hotbeds of left-wing progressivism, and anti-Zionism is the big banner that they hold. So just a quick look at a couple of images. I won't commit to any of the details. I just got these off the internet, but they're just illustrating this idea that you start in the center and you go to the right, and they start to come close to each other as you go to the extreme versions of these things. And another version here does it as a circle where they actually meet. This one is oriented with the center on the bottom coming up the right this way. And as you get into this area, you get fascism, authoritarianism, which is a sign of both extreme right and extreme left. And what we could add here, this particular website wasn't interested in this issue, but this is, of course, anti-Zionism is right here, promulgated by both the extreme right and the extreme left. All right, so this is sort of the background. We're now entering, this is into the introduction of the book itself. I'll take you through some of the ideas here. The key trope that animates the book, and I really love that Scott did this as well. The key trope is this quote here, which is the official motto of Northwestern University. This is meant to set out its ideals. It's a quote from the New Testament, but that works for us, even if we're Jewish. It expresses some very nice thoughts. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Okay, that's a little abstract, but what it's getting at, what it's setting forth, as Scott explains really beautifully, are the norms that define moral and academic integrity. It's sketching what it means to be a person of both moral and academic integrity. The primary goal of the academy ought to be, used to be, maybe in some corners still is, and in some individuals still is, the quest for truth. Universities are about acquiring and advancing knowledge, determining what's true. But in order to determine what's true, there's a bunch of other things you need. You're going to need honesty. You're going to need things like close attention to data and evidence and facts. You're going to need to avoid allowing your theory to corrupt your approach to the facts. Perhaps you've heard the amusing expression that if the facts don't fit my theory, so much the worse for the facts, right? So people in the academy get wedded to their theories, which will then allow them to overlook inconvenient facts and distort or misrepresent other potential facts. But you can't do that. If the goal is to get at the truth, then you have to go follow the evidence. Another important part of all that, of course, is articulated particularly well by classic liberal John Stuart Mill in the 19th century when he talks about on his book On Liberty. If you want to get at the truth, the best way to get the truth is hear a lot of different people's opinions. You need freedom of speech, freedom of thought and freedom of speech. You need to hear all sorts of different perspectives, a diversity of opinions, and then you need to have honest debate about those and set those different opinions against the facts and so forth. The last thing you should have is a monopoly of opinion and the silencing of dissent. And those who are following campuses these days, especially this thing called campus cancel culture, which I mentioned my novel, Nevergreen, is about. That's where we're approaching campuses these days. There is a uniformity of thought. This progressive left-wing ideology dominates so many campuses. Conservatives and Republicans, and even people who just don't agree with every detail, are typically afraid to speak up. Surveys are showing that students and faculty are afraid to express their opinions because we're in this authoritarian situation, and we're approaching that, at least on campus. So this motto is setting forth some norms for the university. And of course, the diagnosis is going to be that conspiracy theories, such as the ones we're about to look at, violate these norms in every way and on every level. They violate the motto. At the same time, Scott links this motto to the classic golden rule, articulated a number of different ways. One way by the famous sage Hillel from the Talmud. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. And what we can understand by that idea is, at the very least, you treat other people, especially people whose opinions differ from yours, you treat them with respect and you treat them fairly, and you can always engage with their arguments and disagree with their arguments, but you avoid attacking the person. And I deliberately mentioned those three things because the anti-Israel movement on campus, of course, violates all of those. They attack the person. They target the Jews who support Zionism. They disregard the facts, and they are unbelievably disrespectful, as evidenced by George Washington University students yelling, "Get the F out," to their Jewish peers. Seeing the right-wing anti-Semitism and the left-wing anti-Zionism as conspiracy theories just helps make so clear how they violate these norms. And of course, if they violate these norms, they should have no place on a campus. They don't belong on a campus. And the fact that they are very present on campuses indicates the erosion of standards, which has broken Scott's heart and should break everybody's heart who cares about the academy as an institution. So let's meet the two figures that are I guess the starting point of the book. There's two professors at Northwestern that he focuses on, but again, the book isn't just about these professors, it's about what they represent, and what they represent, especially the second professor in a moment, are wide trends that are present on lots and lots of different campuses. So first we meet Arthur Butz, Associate Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering. He's been at Northwestern for many, many decades. And the reason he's of interest to us is that in 1975, he published a book called The Hoax of the 20th Century. He is a Holocaust denier, a full-fledged, straightforward, right-wing anti-Semitic Holocaust denier. Yes, he is an isolated case. There's not so many of people like him on campuses, but the sheer fact that he's there and that Northwestern has tolerated him for all these decades, there have been some words of reproach along the way, but that he is permitted to promulgate his views on a campus like this is, of course, the source of the problem. We're going to look at his views, which it's very easy for everybody, for decent people of integrity, to reproach and reject. But in introducing him, the goal is to compare his views to the next fellow's views. And that next fellow is Professor Stephen Thrasher, who is of the type that is all over campuses. He's the left-wing progressive thinker. And as we compare Professor Butz's views with Professor Thrasher, we'll realize that although Butz is alone, his views are alive and well in his many, many colleagues who are like Stephen Thrasher. Both of them violate the motto and the rule that we just looked at a couple of slides ago, says Scott, by describing Zionism as a malignant conspiracy that aims to dominate and harm other people through covert, dishonest, or violent means. So they share that particular view. It's important to note that even in Butz, his right-wing anti-Semitic Holocaust denial, everyone recognizes that as such, is actually not different from his own anti-Zionism. He sees the Holocaust as a hoax perpetrated by Jews and Zionists on behalf of Israel. He sees Israel as the mechanism by which those nasty Jews play their dirty tricks on the world. So it's the anti-Semitic with respect to the Holocaust denial, but it goes hand in hand with the anti-Zionism, because Zionism, this Jewish state, is the mechanism by which Jews do their dirty work. And when you look at his discussion and conception of anti-Zionism, his hostility towards the Jewish state, you will see it's indistinguishable from that expressed by the left-wing progressive assistant professor of social justice and reporting, and assistant professor of journalism, and holding a chair of social justice and reporting, a very paradigm left-wing progressive faculty member. When they speak about Israel, they are essentially indistinguishable. The only difference, perhaps, is Butz might be more willing to call the perpetrators Jews, whereas Thrasher will be more circumspect and call them Zionists. But the content of their positions and their rhetoric is essentially indistinguishable. Good to take a moment and think about how these points, the right-wing anti-Semitism and the left-wing anti-Zionism, come together in the person of well-known controversial Congressional Representative Ilhan Omar. And these are a few of her rather well-known quotes on social media. Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it's okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country, referring to Jews' support of Israel. It's all about the Benjamins, baby, commenting on why politicians tend to be pro-Israel because, you know, there's money in that. 2 points to make about quotes like this. And she is, of course, a left-wing progressive heroine, a darling. Note that on her view, all the Jews, all the American Jews are in on the conspiracy. We're all essentially Zionist agents doing the work of Israel here by getting the government to listen to us. And notice too, how ordinary activity that absolutely everybody does, and not just the Jews, but the Arabs, the Palestinians, the oil companies, the baking soda people, the NRA, Planned Parenthood, everybody does the following. They lobby their congressional representatives. They try to persuade people of their point of view. They try to advocate for their interests. These are normal, ordinary activities everybody does. They're an essential part of a healthy democracy. But when Jews do it, it's sinister. Jews are doing hypnosis. They're hypnotizing people. They are buying people, purchasing people. They have dual allegiance. They can't be trusted. So never mind the fact that Representative Omar spends all her time supporting the Palestinians. Somehow the dual allegiance trope never seems to go back to her. But if Jews support Israel, it's dual allegiance. So when Jews do something ordinary, it's sinister. That is the most obvious mark of anti-Semitism. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The indistinguishability of right-left anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, these positions. Just a few points to make here. The website antizionism.org is actually run by a, sounds left-wing, is run by a neo-Nazi white supremacist group. No surprise. Ultimately. In fact, all right-wing anti-Semites will also be anti-Zionist, basically because they claim, as we noted with Butts a moment ago, they claim that evil Jews dominate the world and Israel is the mechanism by which Jews manage to dominate the world. But then, of course, they can hide their anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism because that maybe has the veneer of being a legitimate political opinion. But they will then use Israel as an excuse to target Jews physically, verbally, online. Zionist, the word Zionist becomes a slur for Jews. They target Jews every time Israel, for example, tries to defend itself. So if you recall, a year ago, May 2021 was the last war basically between Israel and Hamas. And what happened? Jews were being physically assaulted in the streets of Chicago, New York, LA, etc., in the name of Israel. So their anti-Zionism becomes an excuse, of course, to attack Jews because, of course, it's really anti-Semitic. Most or all left-wing anti-Zionism in practice has the exact same overall picture and uses the same rhetoric. And indeed, whenever Israel defends itself, Jews are targeted on campuses, and that's just what we've been seeing when the GW, George Washington University students, target the Hillel. Their anti-Zionism manifests itself as literally targeting Jews on campuses, as well as some of those other examples we talked about earlier. So they call it anti-Zionism, but in practice, it amounts to targeting the Jews. You just can't distinguish them ultimately. Just quickly take a look at this site. It's a little hard to read. I apologize. This is from my the person I think is really the best pro-Israel blogger out there, Elder of Zion. I recommend you read his site. He is thorough, he's thoughtful, he's smart, and he's a tireless advocate for Israel. And he put together a chart where on the left you have classic right-wing anti-Semitic tropes, and then on the right you have classic left-wing anti-Zionist tropes. And of course, what you notice is basically you get the ones on the right by substituting the word Zionist or Israel for the word Jew, but people are saying exactly the same thing. So Jews should go back where they came from, they used to say in Europe, and now they say, of course, Israelis should go back where they came from, get out of Palestine. Jews control the government on the left. Now it's Israel controls the government. We just saw that in Ilhan Omar. Jews control the banks or the markets, right? And Zionists control the money supply. Jews control the media. Zionists control the media. Jews poison the wells, classic medieval anti-Semitic trope. You have literally seen Arabs will regularly claim that Israel is poisoning the water supply of the Palestinians. Jews murder Christian children, the classic blood libel going back to medieval time, but stretching it literally into the 20th century. Israel targets and murders Arab children, which is a very popular trope of the left wing and many NGOs as well. And so right-wing anti-Semitism, just change the word Jew for Israel or Zionist, and you've got left-wing anti-Zionism. And here's another little meme from Elder of Zion, which just captures it so beautifully. I believe this image is from Der Stürmer, the famous Nazi propaganda newspaper. There's the Jew who's gobbling up probably Germans, if that's from Der Stürmer, and all you need to do is put a couple of blue lines, and now it's anti-Zionism, right? But of course, this meme shows so clearly how there's no substantive difference between the two positions. A topic we probably won't get a chance to talk about in detail, but is obviously important. When does criticizing Israel become anti-Semitic? It's an important and valuable topic. It's of course possible to criticize Israel or Israeli policy without being anti-Semitic. Israelis do it all the time. Jews do it all the time. But most anti-Zionism as it manifests on campus, I would argue, is anti-Semitic or driven by anti-Semitism. A very useful video. It's quite short. It's only 9 minutes long. The Unpacked people have a series of very, very useful videos on the topics that would be of interest to members of this webinar. So I do commend this to you and urge you to check it out if you can. Okay, general thesis of the book. By tolerating Butts and Thrasher, right wing and left wing, and all the other professors who are like them, the Academy doesn't merely violate its norms as expressed in the motto and the golden rule, but it actually and actively, ultimately erodes the norms so they're no longer operative anymore. Really, it rots the institution from the inside out. And in so doing, it thus fosters the environment that can lead to open targeting of and exclusion of Jews on campus, like the episodes that we started with at the beginning, all of which culminated in the most chilling way in that wave of statements that came out in May 2021, that last war between Israel and Hamas, where not only were Jews being assaulted in the streets of major cities of North America, it was also Toronto and Montreal come to mind, also in Canada, and also in Europe. But on campus, what happened on campus? We saw this wave, literally hundreds of different departments on North American campuses, not just individuals, but entire departments, like the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, anthropology departments, Department of Asian American Studies at a number of different institutions. Entire departments put out statements. Mind you, Hamas was raining thousands of missiles down on innocent Israeli citizens. So while Israel's being attacked and defending itself, they put out statements condemning Israel, and not just condemning Israel, but the most vile, horrible accusations and language, accusing Israel of perpetrating mass slaughter, ethnic cleansing, genocide, all in the name of Jewish supremacy. That's the phrase that's been popping out in the last couple of years. Israel is acting in the name of Jewish supremacy and committing genocide against the Palestinians. And then, of course, these statements all added, we need to banish Zionists from our campuses, right? No space, get the fuck out, Zionists. Hundreds of these statements. These statements, as we're getting to more details of the conspiracy theories, are so divorced from reality. Whatever's going on in, let's say, that last conflict or in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more generally over the decades, it is not Israel perpetrating ethnic cleansing, mass slaughter, genocide in the name of Jewish supremacy. Phrases like that could come right out of Nazi propaganda. It's invented. Libel and slander are two mild words, right? So what you have is this frenzy of hate expressing itself on the letterhead of the UCLA Department of Asian American Studies, just to mention one that comes to mind. Academics with PhDs sign their names to these documents, How is that possible? Well, this kind of thing doesn't happen overnight. It's not like one day the academy was perfectly fine and everybody was pursuing knowledge and getting along just fine, and then the next day they issue these statements. No, it's something that builds up over time. Start off by tolerating local minor deviations from the norms, and before long, you have people who can sign their names to utterly fictional statements that are literally endorsing physical actions against Jews on the letterhead of prestigious universities, entire departments. Can you imagine what it's like to be a Jewish student who might be studying in the Department of Women and Gender Studies when the entire department puts their name to a statement like that? So by tolerating these conspiracy theories as represented by Butts and Thrasher, and we'll get into more details momentarily, they're destroying the norms, and you destroy the norms long enough, they're gone. And once they're gone, you can get these statements like this. If this sounds a little like 1930s Germany, people are often, hesitant to make Holocaust comparisons, and I do understand that and respect that, but I can't help but think this sounds a little like 1930s Germany. If it sounds that way, it's because it is like 1930s Germany. The Nazis, too, began via vile propaganda, inventing fictions and lies, expressing their hate towards Jews. And amongst the first actions of the Nazis was to purge the Jews out of the universities, get rid of all the Jewish professors. Right? It's exactly what we're seeing now. Now, this truck with this image, I'm sorry if it shocks you. I know it shocks some people. This is just from a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned how Students for Justice in Palestine essentially is attempting to ban Jews from as many student groups at the law school there as they can. And this group, Accuracy in Media, I don't really know anything about them, but a lot of people misunderstood this truck. They thought this was some white supremacists sort of supporting the SJP action at Berkeley law. Let's all ban the Jews. But in fact, when you go to the website, they're condemning it. What they're basically pointing out is what I just pointed out, is that this action is very Nazi-like, to exclude the Jews from the spaces of the university, is to make them unwelcome on their campus. Well, that's exactly what the Nazis did. There was a lot of debate in the Jewish community. Not a lot of people, not everybody liked this particular strategy. I personally thought it's brutal and devastating, and it makes the point that what's going on here from the Jewish perspective is really scary. It's really scary. There's violence on the way. I'm a little bit of a pessimistic person, I'm sorry, but there's violence on the way. We're seeing it in the assaults on the streets. There's been physical violence and physical vandalism, of course, on campuses. It's scary. It's scary. Okay. As we now get into part one of the book, we'll get a deeper dive into what a conspiracy theory is, and we'll see how, once we get a sense of what conspiracy theories are, we'll see how Butts and Thrasher really fit the description perfectly. Okay, so chapter 2 is a really nice chapter describing conspiracy theories. You probably have in mind some of the classic examples of conspiracy theories: the Kennedy assassination, the idea that NASA faked the moonwalk, or that Jews or Israel or the United States government are responsible for 9/11. There's no shortage of these theories out there. They have a number of sort of classic properties or features. They typically claim to be explanations of political or social phenomena that are the result of some covert conspiracy by powerful and secret malevolent actors. They generally have at least the big ones have some sort of political agenda. In our case, it's to destroy Israel and to stop the Jews. They tend to have very oversimplified claims about what is usually very complex phenomena. They tend to involve, and I should probably emphasize these, dubious and improbable hypotheses. What makes something a conspiracy is that on the face of it, it's dubious, maybe to the point of ridiculous. And the person committed to theory has some crazy thinking to support something which on the face of it is really dubious, improbable, maybe ridiculous. So just to mention one idea here, the idea that Jews control the world, the idea that Jews control anything, in fact, they barely control Israel, to be honest. But the fact that the idea that Jews control the world is so ludicrous, you can't even begin to imagine how someone could entertain the thought, and any rational, honest person could entertain the thought. Jews are a tiny fraction of the world population, something like what, 0.02%. There's 15 million Jews in the world. There's 9 billion people. There's a billion Muslims. So the 15 million Jews somehow control the billion Muslims. There's more than a billion Christians and all the other religions. The idea that such a small percentage of people could somehow control is beyond ludicrous. On top of that, the Jews are not exactly a monolith. You know, you ask two Jews, you get three opinions. Jews are divided amongst themselves. Just look at Israel. Just look at diaspora Jews talking about Israel. Just look at any synagogue, which invariably breaks down into factions. So not only are Jews a ludicrously tiny percentage of the world population, they also are divided amongst themselves. They do not have a unified agenda. So that's what I mean when I say at least the conspiracy theories that we're looking at, they begin from a position of literally ludicrousness. It's not a surprise then that they have a very dubious relationship to facts and evidence. I might say an allergy, we could even say, to facts and to evidence. So they will either make up claims entirely, just literally invent something, or they'll assert something without any evidence for it whatsoever. Or they'll take something that's true, they'll take some true fact or true point, but then they'll weave it into some sort of complicated or contorted narrative that, of course, will end up making the Jews or Israel look sinister. They certainly will never accept falsification. So if you offer some counter evidence or try to disprove it, they'll find a way to either discount it or they'll claim it's part of the cover-up or something along those lines. Just to illustrate these with a couple of very small examples before we get into some of the bigger stuff in the time that we have. So here's how you can maybe take a true fact and weave it into a contorted narrative. In the course of the numerous conflicts between the Israeli and Palestinians, there's violence, there's military action, there's terrorism, there's militants, right? There's fighting. In the course of that conflict, inevitably, a Palestinian civilian dies. More than one, a number of them die. Or a Palestinian child dies, particularly tragic cases of those. Or this past summer, a Palestinian journalist died. This woman named Shireen Abu Akleh died. That happens. Immediately, the propaganda outlets, the anti-Israel outlets, immediately say Israel did it. Israel's responsible, even though in the early days of this, no one can possibly know. After all, both sides are shooting. Both sides are shooting missiles, sending missiles at each other or whatever. You can't know who killed the relevant person, but instantly it's Israel did it without any basis. And 5 minutes after that, it's Israel did it deliberately. And so you will see the claim that Israel deliberately targets civilians, deliberately targets children, deliberately targeted this journalists and medics, because occasionally medics get killed because they're in conflict zones, etc. Right? So on the basis of no evidence, Israel did it, and then no evidence further. In fact, this goes against there's essentially no way Israel would ever deliberately target these things for reasons we could discuss, but it becomes Israel deliberately targeted these civilians. And that, of course, is because Jews are bloodthirsty. Jews are primitive, bloodthirsty animals. And so the anti-Semitic stereotype quickly bubbles up. So you can take a true fact, a civilian died, and you weave it into a narrative, which within 10 minutes has people spreading all over the internet that Jews are bloodthirsty, the classic blood libel. They then, of course, when confronted with an investigation about the facts of the case, so the IDF as a professional army, any type of complicated issue or controversial thing, they do a thorough investigation of. I've read a few of these over the years, and they are incredibly detailed. They certainly look objective to anyone who's honest and sincere. And indeed, sometimes they find their soldiers at fault. Sometimes soldiers are disciplined. Sometimes they find their rules of engagement at fault. They make corrections because they don't want innocent civilians to die in the course of this conflict, but they're even willing to blame themselves sometimes. But if you ever show one of these reports, which shows, for example, that Israel didn't do it, that report will be dismissed without even reading it. And they'll simply say, well, of course, they're just covering it up. But then that's a person who's decided in advance Israel is guilty and no facts or evidence is ever going to dissuade me otherwise. And that's exactly how a conspiracy theory works. I'll mention one other example, and then I think I will start to wrap up so we can have some time for questions. You might have heard the phrase pinkwashing. It's small, but in my mind, it's huge. It's so deeply offensive, despite being a small thing. The phrase whitewash, to whitewash, of course, is to cover up like some evil or bad thing. You whitewash it. So pinkwashing is the idea or allegation that Israel, which is by far the most progressive nation in the Middle East, it has not only with respect to LGBTQ issues, right? It's got, it's the only place where it's relatively safe to identify that way. It's got not only the largest, but probably the only pride parade in the Middle East. So for progressives who allegedly care about this issue, and this is an important issue for them, you would think they would at least appreciate Israel in this conflict. But no, they come up with this idea that Israel only does this in order to pinkwash their various crimes, the crimes of the occupation, the crimes of the ethnic cleansing, the crimes of the genocide, etc. They're trying to cover up their misdeeds by pretending to do something virtuous. So what this basically means is that Israel, and by extension Jews, can never do anything that's good or positive in the eyes of this person. Anything that's good or positive is now twisted into an attempt to cover up the evil malevolence. It becomes part of the conspiracy. And this is a very common accusation, certainly on campuses, that Israel is guilty of pinkwashing. All right, let me do one more slide and then we'll pause here. So at least I want to call your attention to this book, Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Although you can trace conspiratorial anti-Semitism back to the earliest Christian anti-Semitism, certainly in the modern era, this is the birthplace of the modern era of conspiratorial anti-Semitism. This book was published, I think, 1903. It was published in Russia. It's not entirely known who published it. It purports to be the secret minutes of the first Zionist Congress, which occurred in Basel in 1897. So the idea was that conference was actually open and public. Anybody could attend, and they released reports about the conference. But in the back room, the elders, the secret leaders, were discussing their secret plans. And this is where is birthed at least the modern version of the idea that Jews control politicians, Jews control the banks, Jews control the media, Jews deliberately start all the wars in the world in order to profit from them, and Jews have a plan for world domination. All of this comes out of this book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And despite the fact that it was thoroughly debunked a few years after it came out, it was proven that the book is totally a forgery. It actually plagiarizes a 19th century novel. There's large passages from this other novel. That didn't stop this book from spreading all throughout Europe in numerous translations. Henry Ford published it basically in his high circulation newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan in the 1920s. This book informed the Nazis. Hitler had a copy of it and studied it. It's still available and it's read as fact to this day by many people around the world. And it's a bestseller in various Arab countries to this day, despite the fact that it was debunked literally 100 years ago now. There's a straight line from this book to the Holocaust, right? So this is ground zero for these conspiratorial, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.